Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
Good morning, I'm Nathan Hager.
And I'm Karen Moscow. Here are the stories we're following today.
Karen, we begin with the latest on efforts to end the war in Ukraine. President Trump held a 2-hour phone call yesterday with Russian President Vladimir Putin. He came away from it saying both sides will immediately start negotiations, but possibly without the U.S. The president talked about the call at the White House last night.
I think something's going to happen. It's a very big egos involved, I tell you. Big egos involved, but I think something's going to happen. And if it doesn't, I'd just back away and they're going to have to keep going.
President Trump says the war should have remained a European situation. At the same time, he says he's not ruling out further sanctions on Russia, but he's not giving a timeline for talks. We get more from Bloomberg's Piotr Skolimowski.
Trump described the conversation as excellent. Putin talked about it being frank and constructive. As a matter of fact, what was produced was certain commitment for Russia and Ukraine to present memorandums that will then go up for discussions. But what Trump made clear is that he is effectively stepping away as a broker in the conflict in trying to kind of be a referee in bringing the two sides together.
Bloomberg's Piotr Skolimowski reports President Trump also talked about the Vatican as a possible host for peace negotiations.
Now to the latest on the war in the Middle East, Nathan. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says Israel will take over the entire Gaza Strip and the military will carry out a, quote, unprecedented attack on Hamas. The new developments come as the leaders of France, Britain and Canada called on Israel to stop its military operations in Gaza and allow humanitarian aid to enter the territory. Here's British Prime Minister Keir Starmer.
It is a really serious, unacceptable, intolerable situation, and that's why we are working intensely to coordinate with other leaders how we respond to this.
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Qatar's Prime Minister says Israel's new Gaza offensive will prevent peace.
Back in Washington, Karen, President Trump will be on Capitol Hill later this morning. He'll be pressuring Republicans to put their differences aside and get behind his big tax and spending cut package. Plenty of disagreements remain, including on how much to cut programs like Medicaid and food stamps and how much to raise the state and local tax deduction. But House Speaker Mike Johnson says they're getting there.
This is arguably the largest and most comprehensive piece of legislation that Congress has worked on in probably generations. One of the most in the history of the country. There's a lot of moving parts and a lot of preferences and ideas on how to handle all that.
House Speaker Mike Johnson spoke after a late-night meeting with Republicans from high-tax states. He is still hoping for a vote on the package by the end of the week. And we're going to hear more from Speaker Johnson tomorrow. He sits down with Bloomberg's Anne-Marie Hordern in Washington. We'll bring you that conversation live at 9 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg Radio and the Bloomberg podcast page on YouTube.
Well, Nathan, it's back to normal this morning for tens of thousands of rail commuters following a strike settlement at New Jersey Transit. And we get the latest with Bloomberg's John Tucker. John, good morning.
Yeah, normal so far, Karen. The first scheduled train was number 3806. It left Trenton just before 4 a.m. and headed to Newark and New York Penn Station. Now, this morning is the first time the trains are running in 4 days. After a walkout that started early Friday, New Jersey Transit and the Train Engineers Union did reach a tentative agreement on Sunday, but it took at least a day to inspect tracks and conduct safety checks. On its website this morning, NJ Transit indicates all trains are on time, and if tickets or passes expired during the strike, they will still be honored. And the state officials had asked commuters to work from home during the strike if their presence in the workplace was not considered essential. It's now the union's job to go back and brief their members and put the agreement up for ratification. The engineers had already voted down a previous agreement, but New Jersey Governor Phil Murphy says he has a high degree of confidence that the engineers will find the new terms acceptable. In New York, I'm John Tucker, Bloomberg Radio.
All right, John, thanks. Many of those commuters are headed to Wall Street this morning. They'll find futures headed lower following yesterday's turnaround. Retail investors helped fuel the S&P 500 to another day of gains. We get more from Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel.
6 straight days gains for the S&P 500, and we totally shrugged off the Moody's downgrade. I mean, yesterday morning at one point, the S&P was down 1.4% in the futures. It totally reversed that in the afternoon. I think the takeaway was that Moody's, frankly, isn't telling us anything new. We already knew about the interest expense. We already knew about this wide deficit of the U.S. government, and frankly, it just opened up a dip buying opportunity.
Bloomberg's Valerie Teitel says individual investors purchased a net $4.1 billion in U.S. stocks through 12:30 p.m. in New York. That's the largest level ever for that time of day. J.P. Morgan Chase says it broke the $4 billion threshold by noon for the first time ever.
Nathan, Carlyle Group co-founder David Rubenstein sees the U.S. deficit as a bigger issue than trade. At an event hosted by the firm in Tokyo, the billionaire said the U.S. has been allowed to accumulate debt because the dollar is the world's reserve currency. He said, quote, if we don't get it under control, at some point people will become more nervous about the dollar as a reserve currency and its stability. David Rubenstein also hosts peer-to-peer conversations on Bloomberg Television.
And Karen, J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon says elevated inflation and stagflation are more likely than many think, and that today's markets aren't pricing in the chance of a downturn. Dimon spoke yesterday at J.P. Morgan's Investor Day.
You haven't seen an effect of tariffs. The market came down 10%, it's back up 10%. I think that's an extraordinary amount of complacency. That's my own view. That when I've seen all these things adding up that are on the fringes of extreme kind of thing, I don't think we could predict the outcome, and I think there's a chance of inflation going up, and stagflation is a little bit higher than other people think.
But J.P. Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon predicts his bank will be fine amid the market turbulence. The firm sticking with its forecast for full-year net interest income of $94.5 billion.
We turn to the economy now, Nathan. And Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic still expects the central bank to deliver one interest rate cut this year, but the timing will depend heavily on trade policy. Bostic told Bloomberg's Michael McKee prolonged tariff negotiations could delay the Fed's next move.
Things could go faster. It could be the case that these negotiations bear a lot of fruit. We know what the numbers are, and they perhaps come in lower than people are expecting. In that case, we may be able to pull forward some of our actions because there may not be as much that we need to do in terms of managing the price level.
Atlanta Fed President Raphael Bostic spoke to Bloomberg at the Atlanta Fed annual policy and research event, and you can watch the full conversation on the Bloomberg podcast page on YouTube. And it's time now for a look at some of the other stories making news in New York and around the world. And for that, we're joined by Bloomberg's Michael Barr. Michael, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. NTSB officials continue to investigate after a Mexican Navy tall ship that crashed into the Brooklyn Bridge Saturday night, killing 2 crew members. The ship was said to have lost power before its masts hit the main span of the bridge. NTSB member Michael Graham.
There is no significant structural damage to the load-bearing elements of the bridge. There is some damage on one of the travelers, which they use to access and survey the bridge at this point, but nothing structural from the bridge is an issue at this point.
The NTSB's Michael Graham says the training ship was carrying nearly 300 people. New Jersey's top federal prosecutor says she is charging Democratic Representative LaMonica McIver with assault after a skirmish with federal officers who arrested the mayor of Newark outside an immigration detention center. Interim U.S. Attorney Alina Habba also announced that her office is dismissing the misdemeanor case brought against Newark Mayor Ras Baraka. Tornadoes have been reported from Oklahoma to Nebraska overnight as severe storms move across the country. Bloomberg's Craig Allen has more.
Severe thunderstorms have been spawning tornadoes and producing baseball-sized hail, moving out of the Central Plains and the Mississippi Valley states, and now going into the lower Ohio Valley as well as Tennessee Valley states, an enhanced risk for over 250,000 square miles across the east central portion of the U.S. for today, and nearly 30 million people will be under some kind of severe thunderstorm or tornado watch at some point during the day.
Bloomberg's Craig Allen. Singer Dawn Richard has told the jury in the sex trafficking and racketeering trial of Sean Diddy Combs that he threatened her with death if she told anyone that she saw the influential hip-hop promoter beat his longtime girlfriend, the singer, Cassie. Global news 24 hours a day and whenever you want it with Bloomberg News Now. I'm Michael Barr, and this is Bloomberg, Karen.
All right, Michael Barr, thank you. Time now for the Bloomberg Sports Update. Here's John Stashower. John, good morning.
Good morning, Karen. The Mets lost again. They are in a slump, and they are no longer in first place. At Fenway Park, the Red Sox got to Mets ace Kodai Senga early on.
Another line drive. That one down the right field line. All the way to the wall. Narvaez churning around third. He's being waved in. He's going to score. Into third base, standing up with another triple. Jaron Duran to go with his double in the first inning. The Sox are on top 3-0.
Nest in the call. Red Sox led 3-1 third inning. There was no scoring after that. Mets have now lost 4 of their last 5. They are under 500 on the road and under 500 over their last 23 games. And when the Phillies won at Colorado, the Phils moved ahead of the Mets in the NL East. Juan Soto is batting just .246.
I think it's part of the game. It's not always going to be great. You know, we're going to have up and downs. We just got to keep our chin up and keep moving forward. You know, it's a game of failure. Sometimes you're going to fail, and you just got to keep moving forward.
Soto has only driven in 20 runs with the Yankees last season. He drove in 109. Yankees at the stadium tonight to play Texas. The NBA tonight has Game 1 in the West. The NHL has the opener in the East. Knicks and Pacers get going tomorrow at the Garden. The 9th playoff series between the two teams. Indiana has won 5 of the 8, including last year when the Knicks season ended with a Game 7 loss at MSG. Philadelphia Eagles just won the Super Bowl. They've rewarded coach Nick Sirianni with a contract extension. The Eagles have also rehired to their front office Joe Douglas, who left Philly when he became general manager of the Jets. The Eagles are pushing NFL teams to not get rid of the tush push, the play Philly has perfected but got tabled last month and may get banned this week when NFL owners meet in Minnesota. For the play to be no longer allowed, 24 of the 32 teams need to vote to ban it. John Stashauer, Bloomberg Sports. Karen Nathan.
Coast to coast on Bloomberg Radio, nationwide on Sirius XM, and around the world on Bloomberg.com and the Bloomberg Business app. This is Bloomberg Daybreak.
Good morning. I'm Nathan Hager. It was just a few days ago President Trump was calling for new sanctions on Russia if President Vladimir Putin would not agree to a 30-day ceasefire with Ukraine. Now, after a 2-hour phone call with the Russian leader, the president is airing more frustrations with the process.
This was a European situation. It should have remained a European situation. Should have remained, but we have, because the past administration felt very strongly that we should be involved, and we got involved much more than Europe did.
That was President Trump speaking at the White House hours after his Putin call. For more, we're joined this morning by Rosalind Matheson, Bloomberg's news director for Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Roz, if we take the president at his word that it should have been a European situation, what's the feeling in Europe about where things stand now between Russia and Ukraine after this call? Good morning.
Good morning. Well, it certainly seems like Donald Trump at this point is saying, in fact, that he's punting this over to Europe to handle, and that he's not going to be directly mediating conversations around a ceasefire between Russia and Ukraine. And he wants this to happen, but he wants others to be sorting it from here. The question is, can Europe actually do this? I mean, it's very difficult for Europe, which has been a bit sidelined for months in these conversations, and certainly to be getting in the middle with Russia on this one. And so the big question for Europe and for Russia and for Ukraine particularly now is like, what is the path forward to direct talks between Russia and Ukraine? Can those talks happen? Where would they happen? Under what parameters might they happen? What level of officials would be there? And who's going to arrange all of that now? Like, who is the go-between for Russia and Ukraine to make this happen if the US is withdrawing a bit, as per Donald Trump's comments or indications rather yesterday? And so for Europe, probably a lot of disappointment at how those calls went, that Trump did not increase the pressure, if anything, on Vladimir Putin, did not talk about sanctioning Russia potentially, and they were hoping that he would lean heavily on Vladimir Putin to get to the table, and that didn't happen. And so now is the question is, how is this going to move forward? And again, who's going to be able to drive it forward?
Well, before this call, Roz, President Trump had said nothing was going to happen until he gets face-to-face with Vladimir Putin. Is the implication that that's off the table now?
Well, actually, he indicated he's still quite happy to meet the Russian leader and vice versa, that at some point the two of them do want to find a way to sit down together. But perhaps that conversation, while touching on Ukraine, would also be about a bunch of other matters, and most particularly, increasingly, it seems, about the bilateral relationship between the US and Russia, including economic ties, investment ties, trade ties, business ties, and all that kind of stuff. And so it'd be a lot more about the direct relationship between the US and Russia going forward from a business perspective versus it being a big meeting to set the parameters again for Ukraine going forward. So he's still talking about wanting to meet Vladimir Putin. And again, Vladimir Putin seems open to that. But the nature of that conversation might end up being quite different.
Just 30 seconds left, Roz. The Republican Senator Lindsey Graham had talked about bone-crushing sanctions on Russia if things didn't move forward. Is that still on the table?
Well, certainly from what Donald Trump was saying yesterday, it seems not, or there's not going to be a big amount of push coming from the US to put further sanctions on Russia, increase that pressure on Russia in the near term. I mean, Donald Trump did say he doesn't rule out that happening at some point, but he didn't indicate he's in any rush to do so. And that leaves Europe again increasing some of the sanctions on Russia from there, but without the US leverage, which is arguably perhaps more significant on Russia on the economic side. Again, those sanctions may not have so much of an impact in terms of potentially altering the course for Vladimir Putin or his behavior.
This is Bloomberg Daybreak, your morning podcast on the stories making news from Wall Street to Washington and beyond.
Look for us on your podcast feed by 6 a.m. Eastern each morning on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen.
You can also listen live each morning starting at 5 a.m. Wall Street time on Bloomberg 1130 in New York, Bloomberg 99.1 in Washington, Bloomberg 92.9 in Boston, and nationwide on Sirius XM Channel 121.
Plus, listen coast to coast on the Bloomberg Business app, now with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto interfaces.
And don't forget to subscribe to Bloomberg News Now. It's the latest news whenever you want it, in 5 minutes or less. Search Bloomberg News Now on your favorite podcast platform to stay informed all day long. I'm Karen Moscow.
And I'm Nathan Hager. Join us again tomorrow morning for all the news you need to start your day right here on Bloomberg Daybreak.